May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. Across London, Paris, and New York, church bells rang without pause. Flags spilled into the streets. Champagne corks burst. Crowds danced, sang, and wept beneath a sky finally free of air raid sirens. For millions, it marked the end of 6 years of total war. The moment history had promised at last arrived. But thousands of miles away, in the quiet farmland of Iowa, Kansas, and Texas, victory came in a far different form. There were no parades here, no music, no crowds embracing strangers. Inside prisoner of war camps surrounded by barbed wire, the end of the war was delivered in a single sentence, spoken calmly by American officers standing before rows of assembled prisoners. You can go home. The words should have sounded like salvation, like release, like the long-awaited opening of a gate. Yet when the sentence ended, the silence that followed was heavier than any celebration. It was not joy that filled the air, but hesitation. Thick, uneasy, almost fearful. German women, many in their 20s, some older, exchanged glances. A few lowered their heads. Others shook them slowly. Soft whispers passed through the ranks in their native tongue. 9. These women had crossed the Atlantic months earlier under fear and suspicion. Some had served as auxiliaries in the Luftwaffe Communications Corps. Others were nurses who had followed retreating Wehrmacht units. A few had been swept into captivity simply for working near the wrong office, wearing the wrong uniform, or being in the wrong place when the Reich collapsed. They were women raised on warnings. Nazi propaganda had taught them that Americans were brutes, men without mercy, conquerors who would humiliate, starve, and destroy. The Atlantic crossing aboard gray-painted troop ships had been filled with dread. Many expected cruelty. Some expected death. What they found instead unsettled them far more deeply. The camps scattered across the American Midwest were not comfortable, but they were orderly, clean, predictable, and most shocking of all, they were generous with food. Meals arrived regularly. Bread was soft. Meat appeared on plates. Coffee steamed in tin cups. One young prisoner, barely 22, scribbled into a battered notebook she kept hidden beneath her bunk. They feed us peanut butter. Dicky. Strange. Rich. I cannot stop eating it. Her handwriting trembled with astonishment, not gratitude, as if even pleasure felt like a betrayal of the starving world she had left behind. Another woman, once a typist in a Luftwaffe office, told a Red Cross interviewer that she had been given new shoes upon arrival. She had not owned a new pair since 1941. These were small comforts. But in wartime Europe, where families boiled nettles for soup and patched shoes until nothing remained, they were luxuries beyond imagining. So when American officers made their announcement that spring morning, many expected celebration. Instead, they saw tears. A captain in Texas later recalled, "I thought they would run to the gate." Some women did cry, but not from happiness. Their tears were heavy, silent, and filled with something closer to grief. For them, going home no longer meant reunion. Letters smuggled through censorship told of bomb streets, vanished relatives, and cities divided into occupation zones. One note read aloud by a trembling 26-year-old spoke of her mother starving in Hamburg and a brother missing somewhere in Russia. Home had become a word without a place. Behind the wire they were guarded, but they were also sheltered. Federal. Given work. Allowed to earn small wages. Their dignity, long stripped away by war and hunger, had been unexpectedly restored. In Kansas, farm families watched with suspicion as lines of German women marched into fields to harvest sugar beets. The suspicion softened when the women laughed at the endless rows, joking in broken English that America had more corn than soldiers. Even in captivity, humor had returned. The American guards noticed the change. A sergeant in Iowa admitted later, "They looked so young. You forgot they were the enemy." At night, music drifted from the barracks. Accordions carried across the prairie air. For a moment, the sound belonged to no nation. It was simply human. Still, the orders were clear. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners had to be repatriated. America had no intention of keeping them, least of all women, any longer than necessary. What no one had anticipated was resistance to freedom itself. One lieutenant, unsettled by the sight of prisoners weeping at his announcement, repeated the sentence as if it might change meaning if spoken again. "You can go home." A woman at the front shook her head and answered softly in halting English. "Home? No home left." The sentence cut through every illusion. America could open the gates, but beyond them lay ruins, hunger, fear. In the Soviet zone, rumors of mass assaults spread through the camps like wildfire. Even in the Western zones, shortages were severe. Cities were blackened skeletons. Millions wandered as displaced persons. To leave Iowa for Bremen or Dresden was not liberation. It was exile. Officers stood bewildered as women who should have rushed east instead begged to remain behind barbed wire in the land of their conquerors. The irony was sharp enough to sting. America, once painted as a monster, had become the only refuge they trusted. A 19-year-old guard later wrote home, "I never thought the enemy would ask me to keep them prisoners. Some cry when they think of going back. They are safer here than free out there." The scene repeated across camp after camp in the American heartland. Not all resisted. Some were desperate to search for what remained of family and home. But enough begged to stay that officers began to understand the depth of devastation in Europe. The women were not clinging to captivity. They were clinging to the last place where life still felt survivable. When dismissed, they did not scatter with excitement. They returned slowly to their barracks, subdued, carrying questions heavier than any pack they had once hauled across Europe. That night, the lights burned late. Some wrote letters asking whether there was still a roof to return to. Others sat in silence, staring at wooden walls, measuring the distance between barbed wire and freedom. And so the story began, not of liberation in the traditional sense, but of an unexpected conflict. Captivity desired, freedom feared. The gates stood open, and still many chose not to leave. The camps where the German women lived were never meant to be permanent homes. They had been built as temporary enclosures, rows of wooden barracks rising from flat Midwestern soil, fences crowned with barbed wire stretching toward horizons that seemed to have no end. Yet for many of the women inside, these camps slowly became something closer to stability than anything waiting across the Atlantic. Mornings began with the clang of a bell, sharp and metallic in the cool air. Coffee boiled in large tins near the guard quarters, its bitter scent drifting across gravel paths. Boots crunched as work details formed. To an outsider, it looked like captivity. To the women who stepped into line each day, it felt like survival organized into routine. In Texas, groups of women peeled mountains of potatoes in camp kitchens, their hands reddened by starch and hot water, the air heavy with steam. In Iowa, they were marched under guard into fields of corn and sugar beets, bending beneath the sun, dresses clinging with sweat, dirt caking beneath their nails. American farm families watched from porches and fence lines, wary at first, expecting sabotage, defiance, hatred. What they saw instead unsettled them. Laughter carried across the fields. Jokes passed in German, sometimes interrupted by clumsy English words borrowed from guards. One farmer, half amused, half astonished, muttered to a soldier, "If they keep working like this, I'll hire them after the war." Small kindnesses slipped through official boundaries. A guard in Kansas handed an apple to a prisoner during a long afternoon in the heat. She bit into it slowly, savoring the crisp sweetness, and later wrote in her diary, "It tasted of peace." Another woman, once a typist in Stuttgart, remembered her first escorted visit to an American grocery store. Shelves overflowed with canned goods. Soap stood stacked in neat towers. Fabric lay folded in colors she had not seen since before the war. Years later she would say, I thought it was a dream to see so much of everything. The abundance mocked the memory of Europe. Back home, queues wound through streets of rubble for a few ounces of flour. Here bread was soft. Meat appeared regularly. According to Red Cross reports, prisoners sometimes received over 3,000 calories a day, more than many American civilians, and vastly more than Germans trapped in the ruins of the Reich. The irony was impossible to ignore. One woman remarked bitterly to her barrack mates that she had been better nourished behind barbed wire than she had ever been in her own home. The Americans, too, were changing. At first, suspicion lingered. A German uniform, even on a woman, carried the stain of the enemy. But distance softened edges. Guards noticed how the women clutched photographs worn thin at the corners. How letters from Europe left them pale and shaking. A sergeant in Oklahoma later recalled thinking, "They look no older than my sister. How could I call them the enemy?" Music became a bridge where language failed. In the evenings, accordions emerged from footlockers. Songs rose into the prairie night, folk tunes, hymns remembered from childhood. Guards slowed their patrols, standing silently as melodies drifted over the wire. For the women, the music was defiance of despair, proof that something human still lived inside them. Not everything was gentle. Tempers flared. Quarrels erupted over rumors, letters, memories of home. But even conflict carried a strange normality. Inside the fences, they argued like neighbors, not like captives. A fragile community took shape, bound by shared uncertainty and a dignity none had expected to rediscover. Humor threaded through their days like a thin wire of resistance. They teased one another about English accents, joked about cornbread appearing at every meal, laughed that Americans seemed to put corn into everything. One woman, knee-deep in an Iowa field, threw up her hands and declared, "If the war does not kill me, corn will." The guard beside her laughed despite himself. Yet beneath the laughter, shadows lingered. News from Europe filtered in slowly, and each report darkened the barracks. Cities flattened, families scattered, hunger tightening its grip. The women weighed these stories against the warm meals in front of them, and a new fear took shape. Freedom meant leaving the only place where they were safe and fed. Guards noticed the change. Tears during mail call, women standing motionless at the fence line, staring westward, as if trying to memorize the shape of the American horizon. It was not affection for the country that held them captive. It was terror of the one waiting beyond. The camps became places of contradiction, prisons that nourished, fences that protected rather than punished. The women themselves became contradictions too. Soldiers without weapons, captives who feared release. Officers struggled to understand. Why would anyone choose wire over freedom? The answer grew clearer with each whispered confession. They were not rejecting home. They were rejecting ruin. As preparations for repatriation intensified, pleas began to surface. Some were spoken quietly in broken English. Others were written in careful script on scraps of paper. "Please let us stay." The words unsettled the officers who read them. Captivity had become refuge. Freedom had become threat. The barbed wire meant to divide had turned into a shield. By the summer of 1946, the first trains stood ready, iron wheels gleaming beneath the prairie sun. For American commanders, the task was simple: fulfill the Geneva Convention, return prisoners to their homeland. For the women who had lived more than a year behind the wire, the thought of boarding those trains stirred a dread deeper than any fear they had known before. Letters from Europe painted the outlines of a nightmare. Hamburg reduced to scorched brick. Dresden a field of ash. Cologne described not as a city, but as chimneys rising from dust. Even zones under Allied control staggered beneath shortages. Families traded heirlooms for potatoes. Children fainted from hunger in classrooms that barely stood. One Luftwaffe auxiliary read aloud a letter from her mother in Hanover. "Your sister is gone. Your father is missing. The roof has holes. I sleep in the cellar. The paper trembled in her hands long after the words were spoken. Another woman whispered to a guard, "My home does not exist." To the officers, going home was logistics. To the women, it was a sentence to wander ruins. Some tried petitions. Others offered to stay on as workers, nurses, cleaners, anything to remain within the fence. A few dared to ask about marriage, about America, about futures that regulations made impossible. Even these questions revealed the depth of fear. The Americans, trained to expect fanaticism, encountered something else entirely. A 19-year-old guard wrote home, "They are afraid of freedom. They say there is nothing left to live for." As departure neared, the women moved more slowly. They lingered at fences. They traced barbed wire with their fingers as if committing its shape to memory. One guard would later write, "I thought prisons were meant to hold people against their will. But these prisoners held onto the prison." The final days were thick with unspoken dread. Officially, it was liberation. In truth, it was a forced return to devastation. The women packed what little they owned. A scarf knitted in captivity, a photograph given in kindness, a diary filled with words about soap, corn, and music. Each item weighed more than the suitcase that carried it. When the train whistles finally sounded, the noise cut through the camp like a blade. Officers believed they were closing a chapter of war. The women felt they were stepping into exile. As the trains pulled away, faces pressed against the glass. Guards expected relief, perhaps gratitude. Instead, they saw eyes fixed on the receding wire, as if safety itself were slipping out of reach. Freedom had been offered, and it had been feared. The war had ended, but for these women, the hardest reckoning had only just begun.